الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وآله الطاهرين أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه الحميد وقوله الحق أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال ربنا الذي أعطى كل شيء خلقه ثم هداه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers and sisters, today we'll continue our discussion on the series of topics that we've called Islamic perspective on modern day issues. Today we'll discuss the issue that probably is one of the most dominant and one of the most divisive issues that we have in our community, and that we're attacked on a regular basis, is: does Islam treat men and women equally? We will discuss today, inshallah, how were women treated before the advent of Islam. We'll highlight the achievements of the West. We'll highlight what Islam achieved with regards to women's rights. And then we'll discuss whether it's achieved equality in reality, and whether it's achieved what the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt set out to do in reality. It's a difficult subject. There are some elements to this discussion which I will just simply touch on, given the nature of the topic and given that the audience ranges from very young children to the youth. There are a few elements to this discussion that we will not discuss in detail, inshallah, for another occasion. But I will simply highlight or point towards those discussion points. The West has made great strides towards women's rights, even though it's only done it in the last 100 years. Women in the UK were given the right to vote in 1928 through the UK Equal Franchise Act. All women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote. In the US, in 1920, August the 18th, in the 19th Amendment, it allowed women to vote as well. But there's a clear acknowledgement, and again, we've seen in the last couple of years with the hashtag #MeToo and also the workplace discussion as to whether women are truly equal and whether they're treated with respect and dignity that they should be treated in both the workplace and the wider society. So both of these have shown that even in the West, with all the achievements they've made, and without doubt they have made some achievements, there is still some room to improve with regards to the rights of women. With regards to Islam and the Islamic perspective, as I said, this is the one topic that we are constantly, fingers are pointed at us, and people constantly say that this is one area that Islam has not fulfilled its obligation, or Islam has not truly achieved the equality of both sexes. And indeed, as we will discuss today, what Islam achieved 1400 years ago and what it did for women's rights was an incredible achievement. It's just, again, it's got lost over time. It's got lost over our traditions and our cultural biases that we've lived by today. And the true teachings of the Quran and the Holy Ahlul Bayt have not been fully implemented, as we'll discover. However, having said all of that, it's without doubt that Islam did fundamentally change the rights of women and improve their lives for the better. In the famous khutbah of the Holy Prophet, the khutbah of Arafat, which we've touched on previously, it's effectively a manifesto for humanity. It lays out the obligations of human beings upon each other. There is a paragraph in it in which the Holy Prophet declares, "O people, your women enjoy obligations that are imposed upon you, and you enjoy obligations that are imposed upon them. You have taken them by the trust of Allah, and they have been lawful to you by the book of Allah. Therefore, fear Allah in the question regarding women and advise each other for their good. So this is one of his last khutbahs. In the beginning of this khutbah, he says, I may not be with you in the next year. So this is one of the last khutbahs that he has to a wider Muslim audience. It's a big audience on the plains of Arafat that the Holy Prophet is addressing. And he chooses the topic of the women's rights in that khutbah, alongside the rights of others, the rights of blacks versus whites, of Arab versus non-Arab, which we discussed a few nights ago. Before we go into and discuss in detail some of the objections people have raised and some of the points people raise, say this shows that Islam does not treat women fairly or equally, let us look at the state of women before the advent of Islam in Arabia. Allama Tabatabai, when he discusses this topic, he highlights, and I think again we've alluded to this in one of our previous discussions, that women had no rights. They were simple objects that could be bought and sold. It wasn't just by the direct family members, but it was by the tribal leader could buy and sell the women in the wider group. So they had no rights at the time. Very few had any power. Very few had any wealth. In actual fact, in certain tribes, if a girl was born, she was buried alive. So that is a state. That is the world in which Islam and the Islamic teachings were revealed, and the world in which the Quran was revealed, the world in which the Prophet came to teach. Allama Tabatabai observes that it was the Islamic movement, the first movement that put women and made women as full members of society. As full members of society. He highlights by quoting the following verse of the Holy Quran from Surah Al-Imran, Surah number 3, verse number 195. فَاسْتَجَابَ لَهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ إِنِّي لَا أَضِيعُ عَمَلًا عَامِلًا مِنْكُمْ مِنْ ذَكَرَ أَوْ أُنْثَى بعضكم من بعض فالذين حجروا وأخرجوا من ديارهم وأوذوا في سبيلي. So the Lord accepted their prayer, that I will not waste the work of a worker among you, whether male or female, the one of you being from the other. Quran begins to distinguish, and in many verses we find وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, men and women addressed independently of each other. So believing men and believing women. Many verses we find this. All of a sudden, Quran starts to address them independently and saying, you are equal. Women, you're equal before the sight of Allah in terms of your amals, in terms of your effort, in terms of your status before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does this verse say? It says quite clearly that Allah will accept the amals of whether it's a believing man or woman, and He will grant them a reward in the hereafter. We've discussed in the khutbah itself that the Holy Prophet said that women have obligations of you, you have obligations of the women. So Islam came to try to get rid of this idea that women have no status in society. It said, no, you have a status. Famously, Allama Tabatabai points out that Islam established equality for women on all issues except for 3. The words of Allama Tabatabai. It says Islam established equality for women on all issues except for 3. One is leadership, the other is the judiciary, and the last one is warfare. He's summarizing, he's providing an a high-level opinion on this. And we'll go into some of the details, some of the other objections people raise. But in terms of leadership, in terms of the judiciary, and in terms of warfare, that obligation never came to women. But even here we have exceptions. Even here we have exceptions. We see the leadership of Sayyidah Zainab after the events of Karbala. She took the leadership. She stood up in the Dabar of Ibn Ziyad and Yazid in Damascus, may God curse them both, she stood up and she spoke. She was a spokesperson for Islam at that point. So she showed the leadership. And we find examples of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam referring to us, saying, oh aunt, what should we do? They've granted us freedom, now shall we go? She said, no, let us stay in Damascus and let us mourn our dead. For 40 days we'll remain here and we'll mourn our dead. And she established what we are commemorating today. The Majlis was established by Sayyidah Zainab. So leadership is there. In warfare, we do find women as a last resort coming to the battlefield. So even when Allama Tabatabai makes this observation, we find there are exceptions. But some of the key areas that people point out, and this is it's an unfortunate thing, is because we don't truly know our religion. So we all get this, it all becomes a big discussion. We see it in the Western press. All of a sudden, it becomes a big hoo-ha. Someone said something, there's a clip that sends around, and there's a big hoo-ha. Because we don't understand and we haven't spent any time studying our own religion. The worst mistake we've made is not to spend any time devoting ourselves to the Holy Quran. I say to people so many times, it's in the Quran. Really? Really? No. The verse of the Quran is very clear on the matter. We don't spend any time on the Quran at all. And the verses of the Quran are very clear on a lot of these subjects. They're very, very clear. So today, inshallah, I'm going to discuss 5 points that people keep bringing up over and over again. And as I said at the beginning, as an introduction, I'm simply going to touch on a few of these issues. And if there is a demand, if there is a requirement, then depending on who the audience is, we can go into detail at a separate event, because there's a much wider audience. There are young children to the youth out there listening at the moment. So I want to keep it at a very high level and a very simple level for this discussion. The first objection people raise is women have no financial freedom in Islam. They're under the control of the male member of the family, whether it's a father, whether it's a brother, whether it's a husband, which is a totally false position, by the way. If culturally we find in certain communities within the Muslim world that is the case, in reality, again, the teachings are totally different. Woman's wealth is her wealth. The woman's wealth is her wealth, and she is free to do whatever she wants with her wealth. Financially, she can do whatever she wants. There is no obligations on her wealth to a third party. So no one has a right over her wealth. Her wealth is independent. It's with her. She can do whatever she wants. She has full financial independence. It's something that Islam established 1400 years ago. When a society treated a woman as a second-class citizen and gave them no rights at all, Islam established quite clearly, what did it establish? That women were financially independent and their wealth was theirs. No one was entitled to that wealth at all. 1400 years ago. So this misconception that the woman's wealth either belongs to the father, belongs to the brother, or belongs to the husband, it's a total misconception that we have in Islam. Her wealth is her wealth. None of them can claim anything of the wealth that she's earned. The big one, the biggest issue, and I hear this over and over again. I've heard it within family circles, I've heard it in the wider community, I've heard it amongst the Shias, I've heard it amongst the Sunnis, I've heard it over and over again, is this idea of inheritance. And there being not an equal divide between men and women. And that shows that Islam does not treat men and women equally. I'm going to give you Allama Tabatabai's explanation because I found it to be the most succinct, to the point, but the clearest answer that I've ever heard from a scholar on the topic, without going into the detail. Let's take an example of there are two people to inherit. There's a brother and a sister. Keeping the maths very simple, the brother gets 2/3, or the man gets 2/3. The woman gets 1/3, which immediately you'll say is unfair. They should get 50-50. That is the fairest way to do it. So our rational mind is saying 50-50. The Sharia is saying something else. Okay, there are various rules around that. We're keeping the example very simple. Allama Tabatabai makes a wonderful observation. He says, as we've made just before, there's an obligation on the man. If he's married, then he needs to spend on his wife and his children. If he has other dependents, he needs to spend on them. Elderly parents, etc., the obligation comes on him. There is no obligation on the wife. Even if she is married, her husband has no claim on the 1/3 that she inherits. Even if she has children, the children have no claim on the 1/3 that she inherits till after she dies. No one has a claim on that. She is free to spend it as she wants. The man has an obligation. He has an obligation immediately. The moment he gets that money, there's an obligation on him. If he's married, to spend on the wife. If he has got children, to spend on the children. If he's got elderly parents, it's his obligation to look after them. The obligation lies with him. The obligation lies with the man. Where does this idea come from? We have to put it in the context. We have to look at it holistically. We cannot take the headline and start an argument without looking through the details. The obligation is on the man. If we continue that point in marriage as well, the obligation is on the man to provide for the wife and for the kids. It's not for the wife. If she decides to work and give and contribute, that is her contribution. She is in full control of that. Islam never imposes a restriction on the wife. It's never the man's to control. But the man has an obligation to the wife and the children. Now do you see why the Sharia has put these rules in place? Why it's said it's not 50-50? Because the obligations on the individuals is different. One is free to do as she wants. The other has obligations. When he gets the money, when the male gets the money, he has an obligation. He has to spend it on various other people. It's not just going straight into his pocket. He has an obligation. And in marriage as well, there's an obligation on the man, not the woman. This is a common misconception. It is woman out of her generosity, out of her compassion today, that if she decides to work and she decides to contribute, she's doing it totally out of her generosity and compassion. There's no obligation on her. The obligation is on the man. And that's what I say quite often. Choose a lifestyle that you can afford. Choose a lifestyle that you can afford, because the obligation is on the man. Set the standards before you get married. Decide on what the lifestyle is. When the two people meet, decide on the lifestyle that you want to, and that you can afford, the man can afford. Don't decide afterwards, we need this, we need this, we need this, and the man can't afford. Because then they're failing their obligations. Decide beforehand. Let's come on the topic of marriage. Women have no rights to choose their partner. That's the choice of the elders. No, Islam again has said, no. The woman has to agree to it. She has to give her consent. Yes, the elders of the community, yes, the elders of her family, yes, her older brothers and sisters or other members of the family will help in choosing, because they've gone through it themselves. They know what society is all about. So they will do the filtering, the interviewing process. They will go through that process. But the final decision sits with the woman herself. She cannot be forced or compelled into marriage. This is a ridiculous idea we have. Just because it's practiced by Muslims, so-called Muslims today, doesn't mean it's Islamic. Just because so-and-so said that so-and-so elder said that one of the children will marry this other member of the other family, doesn't mean it's an obligation. Doesn't mean they have to. If they consent, great. So let's be absolutely clear on this. Let's be absolutely clear on this topic. Consent ultimately lies with them. She may or may not choose to do that. That's entirely up to her. That is the Sharia. What we practice other than the Sharia, that is down to us. So if people point the finger, they're pointing to us culturally, not us as Muslims and practicing the teachings of the Holy Ahlul Bayt. I cannot be more clear on this topic. There are two things related to marriage that come up over and over again. Over and over again, and this is a thing that people point the fingers at us over and over again. The first, with regards to marriage, is why? First of all, are women allowed to choose their partner? Yes, they're allowed to choose. No marriage can go ahead without their consent. Secondly, is why does Islam allow polygamy, i.e., for a man to be married to more than one wife? Why does Islam allow it? And that's unfair. Alama Tabatabai, again, provides a wonderful discussion on this topic. He says Islam doesn't insist on it. Islam does not insist on polygamy. The rules are there, they're allowed, but it doesn't insist that you must do it. So Islam never insists. It's a rule, it exists, but it never insists. And then he makes some observations that you never expect from a scholar. He says, look at the world. Look at the world that we live in. He says, there are, in the world today, statistically, he says, in the world there are more women than men. There are more women than men. So to allow everyone to be fully married, this rule had to exist. And statistically, that is the case. I mean, even in the UK, there are almost 33.8 million women to 33 million men. So almost 800,000 more women to men. So 33.8 versus 33. It's 800,000 more women than men. And we find this statistical pattern across the world. There is always more women than men. So he's saying that rule was almost provisioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the fact that this would happen. The only exception, by the way, when I was looking through these statistics, the only exceptions in the world, there are three groupings. The one is China, the other is India, and the third is the GCC. GCC being the Gulf Cooperation countries. They're the only exceptions where this rule doesn't apply, where there are more men to women. In China, it's a well-known fact, because they had the one-child policy, it's a government-led policy, most parents chose to have male boys, because they could only have one child. They chose to abort the female. So who says that in today's society, women are not killed? Women are treated equally. China is statistical. It's there in the numbers. And it's a well-proven fact. Because of the one-child policy, parents would choose only to have a male. They would abort, they would kill if they were going to have a female. In India, we have the same issue. Indian subcontinent, we have the same issue. There are more men to women. And again, culturally, families prefer to have boys rather than girls. And again, they've used modern science to abort girls. Is it not the same as giving birth and burying them alive, to abort them? When the life has come into the embryo, to abort them, kill them? It's the same. So those practices that existed 1400 years ago have been practiced today. We see them, just different mechanisms, just different ways in which they are done. So China, India, and the other one is in a series of Muslim countries in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia. There are more men to women. And again, there's still this traditional bias against women. Parents prefer to have males than females. And again, they've used science to achieve that through abortion, etc. Not my topic for today. So, Allama Tabatabai makes this observation. Statistically, there's going to be more women, and statistically, we find there are more women than men. However, as he said at the outset, it is not an obligation. You're not obliged. It's a provision in the Sharia that allows it, but there's no obligation on men that you have to do this. The obligation and the encouragement from the Holy Prophet was to get married. There's a hadith of the Holy Prophet that more than half of those that will end up in the hellfire will be the unmarried. So Islam encourages marriage, and we'll come on to this in a second. Right? Islam actively encourages marriage. Right? But there's no obligation that you must have more than one wife. There's absolutely no obligation. Furthermore, before you get married, Islam encourages you to get into a prenuptial. It encourages you for the bride and the groom to sit down to work out their parameters, to work out who has what obligation. So the woman can specify before they get married in the nikah. She can say, this is a condition, I don't want you to get married again. It's up to then the groom to accept it or not. So these provisions exist. Just because people look at the headline number and they say, Islam allows polygamy, they have to look at the conditions. And by the way, we'll come to one of the conditions, which is stated in Surah Nisa, Surah number 4, verse number 3. فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَا تَعْتَدُلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً. Famous verse of the Holy Quran, in which it says you can marry 1, 2, 3, and 4, but it sets a condition. But if you fear that you will not do justice between them, then marry only one. The condition in Islam is, if you want to marry, for men today, if you want to marry more than one wife in Islam, first of all, the laws of this country doesn't allow it, but if they choose in another country to do that, then you must treat them equally. You must treat them equally. This is why it gets to me when I hear people, you hear speakers say, oh, so-and-so was the favorite wife. So-and-so was the favorite wife of the Holy Prophet. How can the Holy Prophet have a favorite wife? He only had one favorite wife, and that's Hazrat Khadija. When he was married to Hazrat Khadija, he was married to no one else. Look at history. He was married to Hazrat Khadija, he was married to no one else. It was only later when Hazrat Khadija had passed away that he did get married to more than one wife. But when people say so-and-so was the favorite wife of the Holy Prophet, it's in direct contradiction to this verse of the Holy Quran. And the Holy Prophet cannot live his life in contradiction to the verse of the Holy Quran. He treated them all equally. He had no favorite wife. There was only one favorite wife, and that's Hazrat Khadija, and he had only one wife at the time. My dear brothers and sisters, pay attention. There is no obligation. Defend Islam when people say, look what Islam allows. Yes, it allows. These are the provisions. Statistically, this is why. But there is a condition. You must treat them all equally. It already qualifies, it already makes people think twice about implementing it. So my dear brothers and sisters, please be careful of some of the propaganda that is out there, both in our community, and sometimes what we utter as we purport to be Islamic tends to be our traditional views. They don't tend to be the true views of the Quran and Ahlul Bayt. The one last topic, and my time is almost up. One last topic is the topic of divorce. Again, people, and I've heard this discussion come up over and over again in various circles, is Islam, why is it that only the man can divorce and the woman cannot divorce? You say that Islam treats everyone equally, why can't the women divorce? Again, there is a provision in the Sharia which says you can enter into a prenuptial where the woman specifies that I can initiate a divorce. First of all, Islam was one of the first religions out there just to allow the provisions of divorce. Acknowledge that sometimes marriages don't work and say, okay, then do it amicably, separate amicably. By the way, when there is a divorce, the obligation of the children stay with the husband. In today's society, the husband abandons the wife and the children and goes up and sets up another home. and doesn't even care. And we have a whole government agency chasing these men around the country for payment towards the children and towards the wife. Islam says, no, 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 no. The obligation sits with the husband. And some people then say, hold on a minute, that means that the husband can take the children. No, the children can remain with the mother. But again, agree that up front. Prenuptials are just coming into the Western society in the last few years. Islam specified that 1400 years ago. So before you enter into any contract, and marriage is a contract, before you enter into a contract, sit down, work out the framework. Work out what is your obligation, what is your partner's obligation. And you can agree that. So a woman can agree can initiate divorce, but they need to have agreed that up front. They need to have agreed that up front. But the obligation post-divorce remains, for the children's well-being, remains on the former husband. I've certainly gone over my time. My dear brothers and sisters, as I've quite clearly stated, Islam has made great strides to equalize women. But in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the eyes of the Ahlul Bayt, equalization isn't necessarily on our function, on our roles day to day. The equalization is in terms of taqwa before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Men have no special status over women. God will judge us all for our deeds. God will judge us all for our actions independently, but in accordance to the power that He's given us. No soul shall be made to carry a weight that it cannot carry. So men have certain obligations, women have certain obligations. The equality is before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The equality is before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The equality will be on the Day of Judgment. We live under certain circumstances. But on the Day of Judgment, Allah will say, okay, those are the circumstances you lived under. I will judge you according to them. So it's in terms of taqwa. That is where the equality genuinely exists in Islam. I'll leave you with one thought, and I will leave you this thought, and it's a very important thought, and that is the greatest achievement that you and I will have in our lives. It's not the work we do, it's not the properties we build, it's not the friends that we had. The greatest achievement we'll leave is the children that we leave behind us. This is why Islam is encouraged for us to get married, for us to have children. Because when you bring up these children, that is when you become aware of Tawheed, and you will become aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's great mercy and blessings towards us. He has put us on this earth. He has put us on this earth and He's given us great blessings. And we can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love towards us as well. He loves us far greater than we will love our children. But the only legacy that we leave behind is our children. The only legacy we leave behind is our children. They're the only ones who will remember us. I was recently in a graveyard. We could see Muslims buried from 1960 in that particular graveyard. And it looked like no one had paid them a visit. The only handful of people working through the graveyard were the children or the grandchildren of those people. It's when a husband and wife come together, a man and a woman come together to build that home, to build that family. To build that family. That is the legacy they leave. Good, righteous children. They're the ones who are going to remember you. Everyone else and everything else will forget you. The workplace will forget you. A handful of us will have a name they'll be remembered in 50 to 100 years' time. Most of them will be forgotten. The only ones that will remember us will be our children and our grandchildren. And that's why Islam is encouraged. And through coming together of a husband and wife, for a man and a woman, to establish a family unit, and then bringing up righteous children, that is going to be our greatest achievement. I'll leave you with that thought, inshallah, and we'll continue the topic tomorrow. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.